Dr. Robert Redfield was the director of the CDC during the Donald Trump first administration. He has a new book out, Redfield's Warning. He is an Army virologist, and he warned Americans that the sexually transmitted HIV virus affected heterosexual women and men just as it did gay men. They ignored him when he called for the importance of early diagnosis for HIV infection. They ignored him for a decade when he warned Americans that the country was not prepared for the pandemic that became COVID-19. They ignored the CDC director during the pandemic when he warned that the government needed to be more, to do more, and definitely transparent with the American public. To admit that the evidence did not support shutting down the country, that certain groups were in greater danger than others, that vaccines offered only limited protection and should not be mandated. Now Redfield is issuing another warning. And ignoring him this time could literally put millions of people's lives at risk. We welcome him back to the broadcast. Dr. Redfield, thank you for joining us. And joining us later in the program, Dr. Bryan Donohue will be our guest. Talk about your book, Warning the Predictions, but also talk about all the warnings during the CDC. Why do you think no one listened? And what was the casualty of them not listening that could have been prevented?
Well, I think probably if you look at the first experience I had with the AIDS epidemic, it's really, and it's the same problem with COVID. There was a tendency that they wanted everybody to follow a single narrative. They didn't want to have open, what I call open, transparent debate. So when it came to COVID, I think there was certain narratives that people wanted to put forward and didn't want alternatives. Let's just say one narrative was related to the origin of the virus, whether it came from nature spillover or did it come from science in a laboratory. Basically, the leadership at NIH had decided that it came from nature, and they didn't really want to have an open forum for alternative opinions like mine, which was that it actually came from a laboratory. When it came to the vaccine, when the vaccine finally came available, and I was part of Operation Warp Speed, and a very important program in my view, December 14th, I think we got the vaccine finally approved. I was pretty much out of office by January 20th. But there was a lot of vaccine policy that was developed I was out January 2021. A lot of policy was developed in 2021. And some of the things, for example, was the decision to mandate vaccines. Some of it was not to articulate, I think, so the American people understood clearly that this vaccine did not prevent infection. It only prevented serious illness and death in those people that were at risk for serious illness and death. But there really wasn't, they didn't foster open debate, different opinions. So I think that's really one of the big downfalls, is that there seems to be a tendency to put a single narrative out, and you either get with the narrative or you're basically canceled. And I think that's unfortunate. My book now about warning is that I'm very concerned that we're at risk for another pandemic. I call it the Great Pandemic, most likely a bird flu pandemic. We have opportunities to get prepared for it. Most importantly, to build our industry's capability of making antiviral drugs, diagnostics, vaccines, countermeasures, and get ahead of the game by getting the private sector involved in meeting those tasks. This is not something that the public sector is going to solve. We need the private sector to be prepared to do this, and hopefully to try to generate the understanding that biosecurity, that is, the potential for new pathogens to come, in my view, is one of the biggest national security threats that our nation has. And if people didn't quite believe that, you would hope that our experience with COVID would at least make people aware of the potential that different pathogens like viruses have that can change our way of life.
Is there anybody in the world that's prepared for this potential bird flu?
No, but there is a clear path on how we can get prepared. And but I would argue, Armstrong, there's nobody really that is prepared to the degree that we need to be prepared for bird flu.
Is it a lack of seriousness that they don't realize just how deadly this can be?
Yeah, I think it's really centers around, first and foremost, they don't believe it's going to happen, and if they do believe it's going to happen, they don't believe it's going to be serious. I remember in the early years when I first got involved in the AIDS epidemic in 1981, 82, 83, I became aware through my own research pretty quickly by the end of 1983, early 1984, that HIV was a sexually transmitted disease. It had no uniqueness to being just transmitted to gays. It just that gay men were exposed to it sexually, but if it's in a sexual pool of heterosexually active men and women, HIV is going to be transmitted. And the second thing I became aware of, and I might add, at the first International AIDS Conference in Atlanta, I presented the data showing that it was a sexual transmitted disease to men and women. And I remember that I got booed off the stage,
Wow.
and that's unusual for a scientific paper. And then the next paper I presented was one that showed that if you studied people carefully in their immune systems, which I developed a staging system, which I published in the New England Journal of Medicine, that the patients, if I had followed them for 18 months, 2 years carefully, that 92% of them actually got sicker during the follow-up period. And at that time, NIH and CDC were telling the American public that only 5% of people that were positive for HIV by the blood test would get sick. And I was saying, I think it's going to be over 90% are going to get sick. And again, I was booed off the stage. And then the third paper I presented was a paper that strongly suggested to the medical community that we diagnose HIV, that early diagnosis was important. And I showed a variety of different clinical presentations that could come in, and doctors should think about HIV independent of whether the person was a gay man or not. And again, I got booed off the stage. My fourth paper, I didn't get booed off the stage because no one understood it. It was a very sophisticated paper studying the different markers on cells that were abnormal in people with HIV infection. So no one understood it well enough, I guess, to boo me off the stage. But it was an enormous reluctance for people to accept really the obvious. Because when we looked at Africa, we saw a lot of HIV infection, and we saw that it was infecting men and women equally. So what's the mystery? You know, it's a sexually transmitted disease, and yet they didn't want to accept it. Well, the same thing I think is for the risk of bird flu. People just don't want to acknowledge it, and I don't really think they will, unfortunately, until they see it. But by then, it's too late if we haven't prepared.
Let me come back to your days as the director of the CDC. Could you now, after stepping back and examining everything, sort of reveal the missteps in the pandemic response from the Trump White House during that time?
Yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about them in my book. And one of the importance is, I think we have lost a lot of credibility in public health agencies, as you know. And I think one of the important reasons was there was a lack of honesty and transparency to the American public. And we really have to be honest and transparent. So when you ask about missteps, it really started from the beginning when it was decided by leadership at NIH and at CDC and the World Health Organization that this new virus in China was SARS-like. And so we actually called it, SARS-CoV-2. Well, it's not like SARS at all. When SARS came into the human species from a bat to a civet cat to humans, SARS really never learned how to efficiently go human to human. It lacked the ability to be transmitted efficiently from human to human. And as such, as you and I sit here tonight, 23, 24 years later, when SARS first was recognized in humans, we have less than 10,000 cases in the world. And so the fact that people said it was SARS-like led to certain conclusions, which the CDC director of China, a very good scientist, George Gao, who I called, he ran CDC in China, and I asked him, whether there was evidence of human-to-human transmission, and he said no. And when it wasn't officially transmitted human to human. And when I asked him, was there patients that had this new virus that were not sick or asymptomatic infection, he said no. Well, that's exactly like SARS. There's inefficient human-to-human transmission, and if you do have SARS, you're going to be sick. So what happened was our public policy that I and others developed, we said this is SARS-like, so when we started diagnosing patients, we were looking for sick people. And then, and I know that in January and the first 2 weeks of February, we had diagnosed 14 people throughout the United States with this new disease that we called COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2. And in those 14 people, we had identified 800 about contacts. Some were hospital workers, some were family members. And we evaluated those contacts, and we only found 2 of them to be infected. So we concluded that this new virus wasn't that easy to go human to human. But you have to understand how we decided were they infected or not. And what we did was we asked them, were they sick? And if they weren't sick, we just let them go. We didn't test them for the virus. The only people we tested for the virus that were people that were actually sick. And about 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, there was a ship off the coast of Japan called the Diamond Princess. And the Japanese were very open to having the American CDC help with it, and they invited us to help them. And when we got onto that ship with COVID, one of the things we did was we tested everybody on the ship. And we found out, to our surprise, that over half of the people on the ship actually had COVID, but they weren't sick. So that meant our whole public health response of looking for sick people and then moving from there was misguided.
It was flawed.
It was wrong.
Yeah.
What we needed to do is have an aggressive program to be able to diagnose it with tests, and we didn't have the test at the time. So a very significant mistake at the beginning. That was, a consequence, actually, that I had asked in January, first week in January, to send about 20 to 30 people to China to help out the Chinese to figure this out. We had worked on stuff before, and I wasn't invited in with the CDC, and I asked President Trump to call President Xi and ask that we could come in. And the bottom line is the Chinese did not invite us in to help them with the pandemic.
And we understand why Dr. Robert Redfield is our guest, his new book. He's warning us about something even worse to come than COVID-19 itself, which is the bird flu. When we return, we'll be joined by Dr. Bryan Donohue. I'm Armstrong Williams. This is Your Voice, Your Future. Welcome back with Dr. Redfield, and now we're joined by Dr. Donohue. Dr. Donohue, welcome to the broadcast. You know, Dr. Donohue, you are a cardiologist, and your work, particularly in the area of the treatment of heart attacks, has contributed to a global transition in how we treat heart attacks with far better outcomes for patients. And you were there actually treating patients during the COVID pandemic. You saw the real world damage. What did the pandemic response do to the care of patients with heart attacks and heart disease? Because listen, the 50% drop in people coming to the emergency room for heart attacks, they were suffering and dying at home, and they were more afraid of COVID than the chest pain and the breathlessness, being breathless, they were experiencing at home.
So Armstrong, first, thanks for including me in this important conversation. And what you said is exactly the case. What really happened for us in the cath lab, primarily I'm an interventional cardiologist, so that means doing heart cath and angioplasty and so forth. And what happened was the volume of patients, the number of patients coming in with heart attacks during, in particular, those peak days of the pandemic, fell by somewhere between 40 and 50%. Not surprisingly, the number of people who died at home of sudden cardiac death correspondingly increased. So what is it we learned? We learned that the message that was being transmitted was so powerful that people stayed at home in the setting of obvious and overt illness for fear of COVID. So just as you said, Armstrong, the sense that our patients had was that nothing can be worse than COVID. So they sat it out. And it was quite a striking thing. And the other thing is the people who did come in during that time frame with active heart attacks had a much worse prognosis than is our usual experience. And there again, the reason is because they lingered at home and came in towards the end of their event. So their heart muscles were more damaged. They had higher in-hospital mortality. So one of the things that Dr. Redfield just outlined from his experience is exactly parallel to my own. And I think it's that we have to be principally clinical scientists. We're not politicians. We don't advocate points of view or products to sell or ways of viewing the world. We're just doctors. And in that sense, we should say things that are strictly scientific and not, in a sense, contaminated with other ambitions. So it's not what we want to be the case. It's what the science dictates to us. And in that regard, as Dr. Redfield pointed out earlier, we might have missed the mark. And I feel that the transparency was lost as a consequence of this ambition to cleave to a single high fidelity signal. It came from the you'll remember the animal market and so forth, while the Wuhan virology laboratory is just around the corner. It didn't behave like a regular virus, and Dr. Redfield, God knows, is far more qualified to talk about that than I am. But and I think that our public lost faith and regard in these iterations of the government, and that's a very, very costly mistake.
You know, Dr. Redfield, so let me come back to you, because you were the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from March 2018 to January 2021, and a virologist by training, and you were at the helm of the CDC during those early and dark days of the COVID pandemic. Testing for COVID was an important early issue in trying to contain the virus. At the time, you said that widespread testing was really the responsibility of the private sector, yet the CDC distributed faulty test kits that failed 33% of the time. Continued to distribute those tests even after it became evident as to their failure rate, and at the same time, the FDA blocked private labs from testing for 6 critical weeks. And so the bill, and I remember even with their issues with the Bill and Melinda Gates and what they supposedly do and don't do, they were ready to test, but when they were blocked from doing so. Looking back now, and this is the point, what was your thinking in managing the rollout of testing in that fashion? And what do you think was the impact of faulty and delayed testing on the lives of Americans?
Yeah, very important point. First, and obviously misreported, unfortunately, in the media. CDC actually succeeded really with, I think with the sequence was made available to us, I think January 11th, and by January 18th or 19th, we had developed a test. And that's how we got to diagnose those first 14 patients. And the truth is, Armstrong, that test was never faulty. That test was derived on initially 2 primer pairs, and we did it at CDC. CDC's role was never to make a test for hospitals; it was to make tests for our health departments. And we got the health departments to be able to use our test, but what they had to do is they had to send the blood to Atlanta, which there's a number of tests that are rare that they had to send to Atlanta. The COVID was one of them. And a lot of the health departments were saying it would be easier for them if they could do the tests themselves in their health department. And so the people at CDC decided to add a 3rd primer pair and then send these 3 primer pair tests out to the health departments to do. Now, that test was never used for a patient, so there never was a time when we didn't have testing for COVID in the United States. You just had to send the blood to Atlanta. The test that we sent for the states to do, as you pointed out, when I was quality controlling the test to make sure it worked in their hands, we found out that it didn't work. There were some false positives. And so, again, it was never used clinically, but I wouldn't allow them to use that test. They had to still send the blood to Atlanta. And it took us, as you pointed out, it took us about 4 to 6 weeks to work with the FDA to go through all that. And what we ended up doing is removing the 3rd primer pair, going back to the original test that we did at CDC, and then go back to the States with a 2 primer pair study. More importantly than that, though, was getting the private sector to kind of step up to the plate to make tests so that hospitals had the test. And you are right that unfortunately the FDA was coming down. I assumed that the local molecular labs in the different hospitals would just do the test because we didn't patent the test. We showed exactly what primer pairs to use, how to make them. And yet that didn't happen, and I didn't quite understand why. Well, I didn't understand why because the FDA was coming down hard on laboratories that were doing non-approved tests. And it took until the end of February for me to get the commissioner of the FDA to change his position on that. And then eventually the private sector came up. Roche, LabCorp started developing tests. But there's no doubt we got hurt by not having testing. I want to combine that with the difference with Korea, because Korea had tests right away, South Korea. And why did they have tests right away? It's a little bit of what I get to in my book, is when MERS, there was a patient that had MERS, which is another coronavirus, comes from a bat to a camel to humans. And they had an individual on an airplane that came from the Middle East and got off in Korea and had active MERS and then infected other people in South Korea. And eventually they ended up shutting down Seoul. It was a multi-billion-dollar economic burden on them. But they got tests right away when the COVID pandemic came, because as a consequence of the MERS experience they had in 2018, the Korean government formed a partnership with the private sector that made diagnostic tests and to respond to the MERS, and they kept that partnership alive. And so when the COVID came, they activated that partnership, and they immediately had all the testing that they needed for the Korean people. And that's why, actually, you may know, the state of Maryland, Governor Hogan, actually got his test for Maryland by going to Korea, because they had the test. So it's part of what I talk about in the book about being prepared. We've got to develop real partnerships with the private sector to be able to be prepared. There's no reason for us to be starting from scratch when we can anticipate the kind of technology we're going to need. I also want to echo what Dr. Donohue said about it was a real tragic reality that as a consequence of the COVID pandemic, originally when you ask about mistakes, the medical community didn't help matters by in a way discouraging people to come into the medical community. And so we did have people present late with serious medical conditions. We did have people not get their mammograms and their colon exams, and so we did see more advanced cancers, unfortunately, as the pandemic evolved. It really was a mistake. And as he pointed out, we had a number of people unfortunately die of heart attacks, as you know, that they died at home. They didn't die in the hospital because they didn't want to go to the hospital because they were discouraged from going to the hospital.
You know, Dr. Donohue, does it really matter where the COVID virus originated?
Well, I think it does. But the truth is always relevant, and I think that, as Dr. Redfield pointed out just a few minutes ago, it's just so important that we keep in mind the power of the advice that we give people, and it appears to me, in retrospect, that it was clear to thought leaders in our health echelons that the virus came from the virology lab. That became progressively clearer and clearer as time went on. And there was a pushback on that you could feel all the way across the room. I mean, Dr. Redfield described it in detail, but you could feel that there was this tension. And eventually, I think the consensus became that this was, in fact, spillover or lab leak, if you will, from the virology lab. But this contributed to the kind of crisis of faith that I think is at the core of our conversation tonight. And that is that we be arbiters of what appears to be true. Not that we be right, there's always the fog of war, but that our motives are clear and what we say is predicated entirely on the data set in front of us. It's interesting that Dr. Redfield was talking earlier about his experience with AIDS. I was a young resident in San Francisco at the University of California at San Francisco, where that nightmare was unfolding in its full domain. And it's quite a thing to have these young people coming in and dying of a disease that you have no insight into. And it was very much the case that early on people knew this was a virus of some sort that contaminated people of both genders and sexual orientations and so forth. But I think, again, we need to say what we say publicly as soon as we have reasonable data to think that's the case, and to not be in any way contaminated by other motive structures.
Your voice, your future, Dr. Redfield, Dr. Donohue, will turn after these break messages.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence, there's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. You know, Dr. Redfield, what is in the news these days is the Affordable Care Act and these soaring premiums. And I know you have a lot of experience over the fact that the healthcare system faces so many numerous challenges today, access to care, rising medical costs, high out-of-pocket costs, increasing premiums for health insurance. You know, the president mentioned going directly to the consumer, removing the insurance companies out of the curtail their ability to further exploit. What recommendations could you give to these challenges that everyday consumers are facing today?
Well, I think we have to realize that what we've been part of, Dr. Donohue and I, for the last probably same time period, 40, 50 years, is that we've been part of a disease system. We really haven't invested in building a health system. And I happen to be an advocate of Secretary Kennedy because I think Kennedy is trying to, he's an agitator for sure, but he's trying to transition that from a disease system to a health system. How do we build a health system as opposed to a disease system? And we really haven't accomplished that, as you know. And there's, you know, how that ultimately gets accomplished, I think is going to take, you know, some serious effort. And clearly right now we have a lot of middlemen that are involved in taking revenue out of the system that's not necessarily contributing to health. And how do we get it so that we can bring that back? I'm a big advocate that you know, all the world, including all of us in America, should have high quality health care, and we really ought to get on to building a health system. You know, building a health system. Hard for me to believe that we're now in our country, you know, over half of the American public is obese. Over 70% of the young people can't pass a military medical exam. We've drifted into being a very sick nation over the last 30 years, and we need to try to convert it into a health system. It's going to be complicated. I wish people would give the Secretary of Health, who I think is committed to trying to accomplish this, I wish they would give him the benefit of the doubt as he tries to make some changes in our health system. I'd be interested in what Dr. Donohue thinks, because he's, you know, he's obviously been a big part of it also.
You know, Dr. Donohue, we do have these chronic diseases. There's an aging population, an increasing prevalence of chronic conditions such as diabetes, and you talked about the heart disease, and then there's cancer, then there's this workforce shortages that we're dealing with, there's this technology and innovation challenge that we're dealing with, and then this thing they call health equity. Your thoughts?
Well, Armstrong, you know, some 2,500 years ago, Hippocrates, who was the father of medicine, made a really interesting and succinct point. And he said, it's the job of the right-minded physician first to prevent disease. Failing that, he is to treat disease. Failing that, he is to ease human suffering. And so the first order of business for us now ought to be prevention. And prevention has never had more power and more authority than it does now. But Dr. Redfield's point still obtains. We are in the business of treating illness, myself included. And I think that there is, though, now a very interesting and important shift underway. Let me just give you a quick example, for example, from the cardiovascular experience. We can now image the heart arteries non-invasively, Armstrong. That means we can take a picture without doing what I do, a heart cath, and look at your heart arteries. We've taken a database called MESA, which stands for Multi-Ethnic Study of Atherosclerosis, and attached it to this new data, and in a cloud-based system can exactly identify the biological age of your heart and create for you a personal agenda of risk reduction. Not a kind of a suit off the rack, try this on, but something made for you exactly by the Italian tailor that you can wear the rest of your life. And it's really, it sounds a little bit like a a little bit of exaggeration, but I assure you it's not. We are close to being able to eliminate the disease that takes one out of two of us out of our life. And so right now, prevention in cardiovascular disease is leaping forward. And I'm sure it's true in other domains, infectious disease, Dr. Redfield, oncology, and others, but it has no cachet. There's no financial reward. It's something that you do as a good citizen, like flossing your teeth or swinging by church once in a while. But actually, it's everything. And it's also interesting to me after 45 years of doing this that there's a soft bigotry here that, oh, the patients, they do what they want. No, the patients listen to you if they believe you, if you are deserving of of the relationship that you've cultivated. And I've seen this so often, the actual regression of established coronary disease. The arteries have a memory of their own wellness. We just need to remind people of that and get going at the real issue here, which is to prevent this from occurring.
And this is what,
go ahead, please.
Yeah, I want to make one comment because it's so important what Dr. Donohue said. This is why it's important that we work to change the mindset of CMS, which is really one of the largest funders of healthcare, because they, by definition, don't fund prevention. And there are some groups now that are doing some really exciting programs where they have certain parameters, whether it's blood pressure, A1C, cholesterol, and the primary care physicians try to move their patients into these categories of having these markers in the healthy zone. And it turns out that some of the larger health systems like the Cleveland Clinic has then compensated the patient for reaching those targets, and obviously the primary care provider. So the patient gets a check for $1,600 a year if they stay in line with their weight and their blood pressure and their A1C. So the emphasis for compensation is on compensation on health. Well, we've got to get CMS to do something. When I was CDC director, I did, along with CMA Verma, to get several new codes put in that actually compensated the doctors for wellness. And we've got to start shifting that the compensation is for wellness, not for illness.
Dr. Redfield, let me just stay with you here a minute. Polls have shown, and you mentioned this in our earliest comments when you were talking about transparency, and polls have shown that public trust in institutions like the CDC have dropped significantly since the pandemic. From your vantage point, you led the agency, what were the key missteps that occurred, and what concrete action should be taken to regain the public's faith and the government's guidance in health-related matters?
Yeah, it's such an important point, Armstrong, because you can't have public health without public trust. It doesn't work, right? Yep. And the fact is, we've lost a lot of public trust. What were some of the biggest missteps? Well, I think there was a lack of transparency. The whole issue of mandating vaccines was a big mistake. The whole issue of not debating this issue of herd immunity, telling people that they had to get vaccinated if they're a 27-year-old firefighter and they had COVID and they had antibody, to say, well, that didn't matter, you still have to get vaccinated, and just mandate it. And all those decisions turned out to be wrong. So that really hurts public trust. Then, I was a big advocate of trying to take on vaccine hesitancy when I was CDC director before COVID. But I wanted to do it from the point of view of teaching the public to vaccinate with confidence. And I didn't want to do it by mandating it or calling them names. I wanted to do it by trying to educate them over time that taking the vaccines were in their best interest, but it was their choice. So I think that the mandating of vaccines that was done, it was a huge, huge problem. I think also the issue that we saw where you shutting down schools, shutting down churches, shutting down government, all of these heavy-handed government overreach programs, which were actually incorrect. have really made it very difficult for the public health community to regain public trust. If we had had honest debates and argued things out, it may have been different. But you mentioned before, I mean, people like myself that didn't agree with certain people about vaccines or didn't agree with certain people about closing schools, the way my colleagues treated a person like me was just to cancel us. They didn't want to have us have a voice. Now, I had a voice as a CDC director, and it took me a while to learn the negative consequences. When, I was out of office by January 20th, 2021, so I wasn't really there when the vaccine policy started to roll out. I argued against mandating the vaccine. I argued against mandating it in the military. I argued against making it a requirement to go to school or college, but I didn't carry the day. And so I do think you're right. It's going to take some time to win the public back, because basically there were a group of people leading public health that thought they knew better than you did about how to take care of your health. No, I think we have to show respect for the individual to make their individual health decisions, and our job is to try to educate them so that they're equipped to make the best decision possible. I'm sure the same as Dr. Donohue when he tells people, how old their heart is and what it is they can do to help, live longer. He's got to get them to believe that and want to do that. He can't just sort of mandate it and say, this is what you're going to do.
And we'll be back.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
So, Dr. Redfield, let's talk about the elephant in the room that many Americans are not aware of. The Center for Disease Control Foundation accepts millions of dollars from pharmaceutical giants like Pfizer and Merck. Pfizer gave $3.4 million and Merck gave $1 million to the CDC during your tenure as director. And it just doesn't have to do your tenure. It happens to all in tenures of these directors. How can the American people trust the CDC vaccine recommendations when the agency is receiving money from the companies that make the vaccines themselves?
Yeah, so the CDC Foundation, similar to the NIH Foundation, these are foundations that are sort of outside of the government. They're not in control by people of CDC like myself when I was the CDC director, but they do have resources that they can choose to help CDC do different missions. I mean, you wouldn't believe it, but as CDC director, I didn't actually have a budget as the director. So when the COVID pandemic came, I didn't really have resources to respond to it. And we actually did go to the CDC Foundation and say, I don't have, contact tracers or public health epidemiologists in all of these states to help respond to the pandemic. And they actually went out and hired them for the state of California and the state of Georgia. But I will agree, and this is where I agree with Kennedy too, I do think you have to be very careful with corporate capture. I think you have to have people on those committees that recommend the vaccines that don't have any influence by the private sector. Because obviously if you do have people that are making these recommendations that are receiving significant resources from these companies, then those recommendations, even if they're not influenced, they're perceived to be influenced.
Dr. Donohue, how have your patients been affected by large pharmaceuticals and medical device companies being financially related to government regulatory agencies? These pharmaceutical companies invest in lobbying work in Washington, D.C. It's one thing for the government to invest and research and innovation. It is another thing when the tables are turned and the companies invest in the government itself.
That's exactly right, and that's well stated. And the real way in which that contributes to the day-to-day experience with patients is it contributes to the kind of crisis of faith that the three of us have been talking about tonight. It undermines the purity of our intentions, the nature of our recommendations. And there's an old adage, again, we're talking about Hippocrates. Hippocrates made a very interesting comment towards the end of his life. He said to know the person the disease has rather than the disease that the person has. So what does that really mean? That means that we emphasize the importance of the relationship between the physician and the patient. And that relationship, if you will, that kind of sacred space wants to be left alone. It wants to be unperturbed. It doesn't want contamination. The good pipe doesn't leach itself into the water. So when you turn the water on, it's not full of lead. Likewise, the relationship between the physician and the patient is, if you will, a sacred premise, which, like other sacred premises, has to be guarded and maintained. And so I think that the principal way that this has contributed is that it undermines that kind of process, which takes time to build. And then there's this issue that Freud described as reaction formation. So people oftentimes it's not so much that they don't believe us, they come to resent us and aggregate in small pockets of like-minded individuals. And this becomes a very hard community to penetrate. Mr. Kennedy, who Dr. Redfield's been talking about, has had this experience, for example, in Texas, where this measles epidemic was flourishing. So I think it's important that the physicians really regard in the highest fashion the importance of these relationships, honor the human beings that we're privileged to care for, and avoid even the pretext of kind of secondary gains. And if you do that, these patients will follow you off the cliff. If you do that and they come in with their arms across their chest and say, I'm never going to get that vaccine, if you just unpack that and kind of get their arms to fall by their side and listen to what you're saying without all the body armor, we can move mountains together. So I think that, it's important that, and I want to emphasize and flesh out one other thing that Dr. Redfield said earlier in our conversation.
Before you flush that out, because I want to make sure I have time for Dr. Redfield to encourage people to get his excellent book, Warning, and why it's important for them to read your thoughtful experiences, lessons learned, what we need to do to protect our country and this country's health. Dr. Redfield.
Well, thank you very much. No, I think I would encourage people to read the book, because I do think it's an honest reflection of, as you pointed out at the beginning, a lot of the decisions that were made and the mistakes that were made, and tried to get at a recognition of what was done that was a positive thing, and what was done that was the mistakes that were made. And the real purpose at the end of it was to try to get people aware about the biosecurity threats that we still have, and why we have to be very careful that we get better prepared so that we don't have to go through even a much more catastrophic pandemic. So, but I think people will enjoy the book. I think they'll find it very informative. It's not a book about me. It's a book about the interaction that I've had in dealing with the HIV epidemic, the Ebola epidemic, the flu epidemic, the hepatitis epidemics, the COVID epidemic, and my concerns about the future bird flu pandemic.
Dr. Donohue, in whatever time we have left, there was this congressional investigation found that members of the CDC Vaccine Advisory Committee's own stock and vaccine manufacturers held patents on vaccines they were voting to approve and receive money from companies. Is this a problem?
Of course it's a problem. It's the same thing as members of Congress flourishing because they have information that the rest of us don't have in terms of participating in the stock market and so forth. But what's interesting to me is what we lose in that moment. And it's like everything else. It's like the relationships in your own life. They need to be tended to, like the wise gardener watering the plants, and they need to be cared for and regarded highly. And I think that this my own point of view, probably a little iconoclastic, is that the government slowly grows and finds its way into every nook and cranny of our lives. And really what we're talking about, the three of us this evening, is that process, that kind of mission creep, where now they become the scientists, not Dr. Redfield, where they develop the policies, not wise men who have dedicated their lives to these issues. And they, in doing so, expand the domain of their own influence. And it could be argued, I would argue, that is the expansion of their own domain of influence, is the primary motive for all of this, not the simple care of human beings.
Dr. Redfield, you have the last word in about a minute and a half, and it's really about, can we ever get beyond these pills and put the power of prevention and purpose back into the hands of the patient?
You know, Armstrong, I think we can. I'm an optimist. I think, you know, and this is again why I like the disruption that Kennedy is causing, and hopefully Dr. Oz and we'll be able to try to get the primary focus on the idea of prevention of health rather than disease. It's going to be a tough turn, but I think it's so important that we really turn the effort towards health and wellness, and put the premium on that. If you look at most health institutions, you know, they still look at the premium on the acute care that they do. That's how they make their profit margins. I think we just got to start shifting it so everything gets aligned. So it's the patient's health by which the provider benefits. I benefit if my patient's healthy, not if they're sick. If I'm working for a hospital system, the hospital system benefits if my patient's healthy, not if they're sick. And this is why we have to realign how the federal government decides to compensate for the health care that we all do, and put the prime goal on health, not disease.
Robert Redfield's warning, what I learned but couldn't tell you might save your life. Thank you both so much for joining us for this edition of Your Voice, Your Future. I'm Armstrong Williams. Get that book. It's a warning.